Hello, good morning everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on the priority amphibian and reptile conservation areas, also known as PARCAs, creative uses for conservation. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This webinar is put on in collaboration with SEPARC, which is the Southeast Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. And my name is Jennifer Evans. I work at Extension Forestry in North Carolina State University. And today we have Dr. J.J. Apodaca with us. And unfortunately, Dr. Stephen Spear of the Oregon Society is not able to join us today. So J.J. will be leading this presentation for us. Before we start, I just have to go over a couple of housekeeping items. If anybody on the webinar is interested in receiving continuing education credit afterwards, there's a couple steps you have to follow. So right now we're on step 3. You've already filled out the registration form and completed the pre-survey. After the webinar, make sure that you stay on the end of the webinar and complete the satisfaction survey. And then there's also going to be a short quiz, and then you just have to complete the CEU form with your identification information at the end of it. So make sure that you stay on after the webinar to complete all of those items if you're interested in getting continuing education credits. So just to familiarize us with the webinar functions a little bit, I see some of you have already figured out how the chat room works. I've asked you to enter your name and who you're with today so that we know who is in our audience. If you're having trouble hearing us, or if you're having any sort of technical difficulty with the speakers or microphones, over in the upper right corner, you'll see the area that's circled is the audio setup wizard, and that's where you can set up your microphones and speakers in that box. And like I said, down at the right is the chat box, so feel free to type anything in that box. Just know that even if you are chatting to each other outside of the main box, that the moderators are still able to see what you're typing. As we go along today, we're going to take any questions, and the webinar is actually going to be broken up into several sections. And so I'll be taking the questions as you type them into the chat box. You're not going to have speaker capability, but if you have questions or audio technical problems, anything as we go along, go ahead and enter it into the chat box, and then when we have the time for questions after each section, then we'll go through and answer the questions then, and then we'll also leave some time at the end. I'll take any unanswered questions at that point, and we'll let JJ answer those questions at the end of the webinar. Just a little bit about SEPARC itself, who we are. So SEPARC is an organization of scientists, naturalists, government representatives, and citizens that are devoted to the preservation of amphibian and reptile populations in the southeastern United States. We also serve as the southeast branch of the National Park Organization. You can see a map to the right of the states that we cover. We have an annual meeting, typically in February. We create informational products for the public, address regional challenges with the formation of task teams, and you can see all of the links there. If you go to separc.org, you can find more information on all of these. Just wanted to put it out there that our next annual meeting is February 19th to 22nd. So go ahead and mark that on your calendars now. It's going to be in Louisiana, and everybody on this webinar and anybody is open to join this meeting. So go ahead and add that to your calendars now, and then more details will be forthcoming as the date gets closer. You can find it on separc.org for all of the meeting information. And then to get involved or become a member, it's completely free. You can find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. You can just go to the website and join. You can also learn more about our umbrella organization, PARC, at their website, parkplace.org. And then if you have any questions about this, just message separc@separc.org, and somebody will be able to help you. So at this point, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our webinar, which is Priority Amphibians and Reptile Conservation Areas, Creative Uses for Conservation. Like I mentioned, Dr. Stephen Spear is unfortunately unable to join us today, so the presentation will be by Dr. J.J. Apodaca, who is a professor of conservation biology at Warren Wilson College and the National Park co-chair. His research and work are focused on the conservation of amphibians and reptiles through an integration of various techniques such as conservation genetics and distribution modeling across spatial scales. He's also interested in developing novel conservation approaches that provide viable solutions for all stakeholders. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Apodaca.
Great, thanks, Jen, and thank you all for being here. We've got a great turnout. This is awesome. There we go. Sorry, I'm trying to get the hang of this software as well. So as Jen said, Steve Spear isn't able to make it today, so if at any time it sounds like I have no idea what I'm talking about, it's Steve's fault, not mine. So as Jen said, this webinar is kind of based on the entire idea of parkas, although we're going to go into a lot of detail about some of the southeastern parkas that we've been working on, and also kind of the future of parkas. And I wanted to kind of start by bringing up this quote from E.O. Wilson that he gave on our 10th anniversary of PARC being in existence, and that's that, you know, amphibians and reptiles play a vital role in the mix that defines Earth's natural diversity, yet they're in jeopardy, and PARC's efforts have moved to pull key species from the precipice of extinction. And in pursuing its goals into the future, PARC will help preserve a significant component of our natural heritage. And I think parkas are going to be a major part of this vision that E.O. Wilson had. So just to start it off on that. So just to give you a quick outline of where we're going so you can kind of help format your questions, as Jen said, we'll be taking questions kind of throughout the webinar during different time periods. So you can put questions into the chat room thing, and Jen will send them to me during the questions sections. So if you have any questions about these items further down the list, you can save them for then. But in general, we're going to start with a kind of, like I said, a broad introduction to parkas. You know, what's the aim? Why are we trying to do them? What are our objectives, etc. Then, as I said, we'll kind of dive into some of the southeastern parka identification that we've been working on for a couple of years now. We'll take a quick tour of those, and then we'll talk about, as we go forward, creating parkas and identifying parkas, how do we identify threats and deal with threats in this ever-changing world, and then hopefully get into a broader conversation about parkas as their role in the broad scale and local conservation. Okay, so to provide a little kind of background context and scope for priority amphibian and reptile conservation areas, kind of the driving factor or driving motivation for parkas is that, you know, there's a real lack of attention and funding from across the board from conservation organizations and states and national authorities for these protection for amphibians and reptiles when compared to other kind of vertebrate groups. And so the overarching kind of goal of parkas is to draw attention to these areas across the landscape that are disproportionately important to herpetofauna conservation. And that's really kind of, we have a lot of sub-goals, as you'll see, going forward for parkas. But overall, this is the main goal that you should be focused on. And the whole idea of parkas and the whole kind of, again, overarching goal is really loosely based off the important bird areas. And I'm sure a lot of you have had knowledge of IBAs before or have seen them in action and are aware of how successful they've been. But just to kind of give a brief overview of really how important and how powerful they've been, there's currently over 400 IBAs just in the United States. And if you go to their website and kind of look at these success stories of what IBAs have done, it's really incredible. Everything from leveraging funding to all the way to kind of encouraging the Army Corps of Engineers to change their flooding patterns in the Mississippi deltas, and all sorts of amazing conservation success stories from this one movement of important bird areas. And if you look at some of the comments on important bird areas and some of their overarching goals, I really like this comment because if you look at it side by side with the park mission statement, you can see how nicely these things match up. And this is from Frank Gill, President Emeritus of the National Audubon Society, who says, IBAs have a unique power to unite people and communities and organizations in proactive bird conservation, one place at a time. And for PARC, the national park and all the regional parks included, our mission statement is to conserve amphibians and reptiles and their habitats as integral parts of our ecosystems and culture through proactive, coordinated public-private partnerships. And I think that public-private partnerships and on both sides of this, and combining efforts and people and places to conserve areas for amphibians and reptiles is really the power that PARCAs could bring to this. And furthermore, not just as a kind of overarching guide for PARCAs, but also when you look at the benefits currently of being an important bird area, there's huge benefits in terms of providing leverage for funding from state and federal conservation. And these include everything from coastal and estuarine land conservation programs to U.S. Fish and Wildlife land acquisition prioritization. And of course, a lot of states provide points and give higher rankings to important bird areas. So, a lot of this comes down to, well, if birds and important bird areas are getting this kind of prioritization, so why shouldn't we have herpetofauna get the same kind of protection and of important areas, disproportionately important areas? So with that, we can talk about the overall PARCA objectives. We've talked about kind of the one main one. Sorry, I just realized my audio had turned down. But also there's a ton of kind of, sub-PARCA objectives that we can talk about and that provide a lot of conservation value to PARCAs. One is the obvious focus more attention on portions of the landscape that play this important role in herp conservation. And as we go forward, you'll see that this, even in the limited sample size we have, there is a hugely disproportionate value of landscape areas across the southeast. Of course, we're interested in addressing the leading threats to herpetofauna, such as land loss, habitat loss, and climate change. Increase in funding for herp conservation. We saw how important bird areas can lead to greater funding for certain areas, and so we would like to give that value to herpetofauna as well. Of course, raising the profile of high priority species or areas, increasing the public awareness is always an important goal of conservation, and so that's, of course, a PARCA objective. And, of course, identifying new or expanded areas where herp conservation efforts should be directed. And I'll discuss the kind of all the criteria in more detail coming up, and I'll direct you to the PARCA document. But just so you know what we're talking about when we're talking about identifying PARCAs, there's really four main aspects of things that we're looking for in PARCAs, with one overarching one, which is landscape viability. And so in other words, we're not terribly interested in identifying PARCAs that have a huge amount of landscape loss or habitat loss, but we're looking for currently viable or possibly future viable habitat patches. And then we take a look at, at least one of the other following criteria. The presence of globally imperiled species is obviously hugely important, especially being that herps are, a lot of the endangered species are really narrowly distributed. Endemism plays a large role in this, and then areas of exceptionally high diversity or high richness values. So if we have any questions on the entrance or the kind of overall intro here, I'll take those now. But in general, if you want to learn more about PARCAs and the model criteria, you can go to parkplace.org and download this great document here, the model criteria and implementation guidelines.
JJ, I have not received any questions in the chat box, so if anybody on the line does have a question, go ahead and enter it into the chat box now. Okay.
All right. Good deal. So we'll move forward. If you take a look at this model criteria and implementation guideline, you'll notice that this is just a set of guidelines, and so each region really has kind of a lot of play in how we implement these guidelines. And I think that's really important because obviously the Southeast is going to have hugely different needs than, say, the Southwest or the Midwest. And so what I wanted to run through here is just kind of an example of some of the criteria and how we actually established our current southeastern parkas, which haven't officially been released yet, but you can see we've done several of the states here: Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and North Carolina. So I mentioned that, or the overarching criteria of landscape viability, and then the 3 sub-criteria that could be met as well. And so what we did is we took this into kind of a GIS modeling framework, and we created a PARCA metric, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail coming up here. But what went into the PARCA metric was different metrics of richness. So in other words, areas of high or disproportionately high richness for both amphibians and reptiles separately, so that one wasn't drowned out by the other. And also we took into account ecoregion, which I'll talk about. We also looked at the presence of globally or locally imperiled taxa, and these included everything from ESA listed species to endangered species, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service endangered species, IUCN rankings, and of course state listings, because PARCAs are really occurring at the local level. And so we wanted to take into account kind of state listings as well as these larger range listings. And then we included into there kind of these presence of narrowly distributed taxa or endemicity, and we included in species, subspecies, and where we could get the data, we also included phylogenetically distinct populations, although most of that was more at the expert opinion level, which we'll talk about. So again, all of these 3 kind of categories went into creating this PARCA metric. And then we combine the PARCA metric with this landscape viability metric, which I'll talk about. This is a way of showing how viable the landscape is across multiple scales, which is a pretty interesting and useful metric that we'll talk about. And so basically we made a spatial model out of those 2 metrics. And then we went to each state and tried to assemble of teams and of as many experts as we could and as many stakeholders as we could. So we had a really great turnout for all of these state meetings. On average, we had about 20, in many cases over 20 different individuals and organizations sitting at the table making a call on what is a PARCA at their state level. And from that, we were able to identify all of these viable PARCA sites. So just a little more detail on the PARCA metric and a few things I wanted to point out of how we created this. This PARCA metric is, again, a spatial model, and we didn't really have any interest in just purely modeling and making decisions on that, because we know that the folks on the ground provide such a huge amount of data and really know areas better than we could ever model. But it was still important to provide perspective, in other words, across the states and regions, to be able to show the potential herpetological conservation value and compare different sites in these values. And so that's exactly what we did. This looks complicated to some, but it's not really. It's basically just the sum of imperiled species combined with the amphibian richness and the reptile richness. And importantly, in those amphibian and reptile richness is we calculated those respective to the region they were in. And this is important, as you'll see later, because if we were to just calculate, say, richness in the southeastern United States, the coastal plain would be like way higher richness values than anywhere across the map. And so if that were the case, most of the PARCAs would be in the coastal plain, and that was something we wanted to avoid. So we broke those down into ecoregions and states and groups for that reason. And again, then we calculated, or we combined that PARCA metric with this natural landscape, which is a metric which was created by Theobald in 2010. And again, what this metric does is identify relatively undisturbed sites or areas across several spatial scales. So what this effectively does is eliminates, say, like city parks, which you might have a value of heavy forested area or a small area of heavy forest that could be good habitat, but it's not good habitat because it's surrounded by shopping malls or roads. And to kind of give you a better idea of what this is doing, if we were to consider a 270 meter by 270 meter square area here, which is grid cell A on the left, and that was heavily forested as represented in green here. It could be good herp habitat. It also, so it'd have a value from how forested it is and how undisturbed it is there, or not forested, but just good herp habitat. So it takes that value and it also averages that over different spatial scales. So as you can see here, you would combine the value for A with the value for B, which includes this whole larger 810 square meter or 810 by 810 meter box, which then becomes the smaller center box and the even larger landscape. So again, if we go back to this figure, you can see that each area gets a value of how viable the habitat is by averaging across the very local scale to the very broad kind of regional scale. So we felt that this was a really good way to kind of identify habitat that was not only good at the local scale, but also had the ability to hold large populations and allow for migration and gene flow. So our goals with this, when going to the state meetings, were to identify PARCAs in each ecoregion that has a high PARCA metric value, i.e. those high richness areas or those areas that hold a disproportionate number of imperiled taxa. We wanted to identify parkas that protected the most viable populations of target species, generally of rare or imperiled species. And we wanted to meet these two goals with the fewest number of parkas possible. And again, this is so that these things really got kind of the attention they deserved. If we covered the entire state or entire region in parkas, they wouldn't be as effective. So as an example here, I wanted to kind of walk you through South Carolina, and we'll be kind of using this as an example going forward because it's the simplest state we've done. And so this is the full PARCA metric that we created. And you'll notice that a lot of the state is open and clear, and those are areas where the landscape viability from that natural landscape metric simply were not high enough for us to consider them as viable habitat. And so they were kind of removed from this map. And then from that you can see that kind of the hotter colors, the warmer colors, the reds and oranges, are a higher PARCA metric, and the blues and greens are a lower PARCA metric value. And again, this is just to provide perspective. When we went to state meetings, we didn't say we had to follow these values, but it gave us some perspective to discuss at the table. So in South Carolina, here are the South Carolina parkas that were decided upon by a team of over 20 experts in the state. And you can see that the PARCA metric actually did a really good job of identifying areas that they later decided on. And but it was still extremely important to have that local expert opinion. For example, this area here wouldn't have been, say, identified as an important area, but this is the only area in the state that has gopher tortoises, so that kind of local expert knowledge is really super valuable in this situation. And again, these are just the South Carolina parkas, how they turned out without the metric. So you can see that South Carolina, as we go through the southeast, you'll see that South Carolina really focused on large, for the most part, large parkas, less number, but large landscapes. And you'll see other states decided to go fewer small or more smaller parkas. But as you can see, this looks great. So this time we can kind of take questions on the PARCA process that we've used in the southeast.
Thanks, JJ. We did actually have a couple of questions in the chat box, and I've noticed that our numbers are steadily continuing to rise, which is great, but that also means that some of you missed the first part of this presentation. So there was a question about if folks were going to be able to receive a copy of the presentation afterwards. So I just wanted to mention that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived and available on the Forestry webinar portal within the next couple of weeks. And continuing education credits will also be available for up to a year afterwards if you go back and watch it on the portal. So this will be available if you missed the first part of it and want to go back and catch it. JJ, one of our first questions was asking about if Puerto Rico is going to be included in this.
Certainly, it certainly can be. For most of the PARCAs, obviously this is kind of a local and regional process. So if you were interested in creating Puerto Rico, because it is included in the newly formed Caribbean Park, yeah, that would be a great thing to do, would be to create PARCAs for Puerto Rico.
Okay. Our next question, I think you must have had on one of your slides. Somebody asks, what does SDGM/SDCM stand for?
That's a good question. Let me go back and see what I...
and I'm not sure what slide that was on.
Trying to find it here. Okay, so that was basically within the PARCA metric calculation. That's minimizing the variance within the groups. So I can't remember actually what I. It's kind of embarrassing.
Well, maybe at the
If you email me, I'll go back and look at our methods. It's been a couple of years since I actually did those calculations. But the general point of that there is to just minimize the variance within the groups. So in other words, amphibian or reptile richness was broken into a scale of 0 to 4, where we broke those 4 groups into the groups that maximized variance between, say, 3 and 4, 3 and 2, etc., and minimize the variance within the groups.
So whoever asked that question, JJ, we'll make sure that we get your email address at the end so that if people have questions, they can email you directly. Okay.
Yeah. Sure.
Next question is, does PARC have a strategy for trying to get PARCas integrated into ongoing conservation planning / funding processes, such as state swaps and Gulf Coast restoration?
That's a great question. So that's going to be a focus of PARC within the next coming year. The next year in PARC is going to be in a year of the habitat, or year of habitat, and we're going to really focus on PARCas and kind of getting those types of implementation, or those types of things implemented. So if anybody has any kind of ideas on how to best make that happen, we'd love to hear from you, and again, that's something you could email me. But definitely that is the plan and going forward.
Okay, we had another question about who was included, and the question is if South Florida is included in PARCA.
Yes, we did South Florida. So that's actually the next slide here. So the states we've done so far in SEPARC are included here with Alabama, all of Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina.
Okay, great. Well, I think we have a couple more questions. It appears that PARCas are designed to protect the lands from other activities, which appears to include forest management. What tools are the PARCas planning to use to protection, purchase of conservation easements, or something similar?
Sure, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but I think all the tools that we have, such as conservation easements, habitat management guidelines, are PARC's habitat management guidelines that are available at parkplace.org, are a great solution to that. So just we're certainly not trying to protect those areas from forestry practices, but rather just raise awareness so that land managers have the ability to help manage for imperiled species or high species richness.
Okay, great. Well, in the interest of time, we have a few more questions. We'll go ahead and save them for the next question section.
Okay, great. So again, to kind of walk through what we've done in the Southeast, here's the total map of current southeastern PARCas after our initial kind of burst of activity within the last couple of years. And you can see that we have a great coverage across the Southeast of over 80 different PARCas, with Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina each having 20 or above. So a lot of PARCas in there. And even though the numbers are pretty different in terms of numbers of PARCas between the states, the total land cover area is pretty similar across, of in the 8 to 11% of land cover represented in PARCA. So from a broad-scale conservation planning standpoint, this is a great thing, right? Because it reduces our area to really focus on by over 90% in some cases. So to kind of carry on this example of South Carolina and one of the states that we focused on and found PARCas for. Again, South Carolina is the simplest one to focus on due to the number of PARCas, and so I wanted to give an example of how this process worked out in terms of what the PARCas are currently protecting or designed to protect. So you can see here, starting from the westernmost part of the state, there's a PARCA identified at the Blue Ridge Escarpment, and this is a really interesting area for South Carolina and really important for herp conservation. It's characterized by really high rainfall. In fact, it's a temperate rainforest getting over 100 inches of rain a year. It's got really great lush cove forests, bare rocky cliffs, and numerous small streams and rivers. And all that habitat goes, or it helps create a huge amount of diversity, including some of the most rare species in the southeast, like the newly described patch-nosed salamander, dwarf blackbellies, green salamanders. There's bog turtles in that area, coal skinks, timber rattlesnakes, shovel-nosed salamanders, etc. So this is a great example of how across the state there's this kind of smaller region here that has really great habitat and a really high diversity of both species richness and imperiled species richness. The Savannah River Valley in the Piedmont, this is a great PARCA because if you look across all southeastern PARCas, the Piedmont is really lacking due to just kind of the richness and imperiled species richness across the Piedmont and the sheer amount of habitat loss that the southeast has faced in that area. And this one site in particular hosts a lot of populations of Webster salamanders, including the easternmost population of Webster salamanders, which are pretty rare species. We have the fall line Sandhills, which contains records for the southern hognose, pine snakes, and possibly the state-threatened pine barrens tree frog here. So again, another Piedmont-ish fall line Sandhills area PARCA that protects a wide variety of different imperiled taxa. And of course the coastal plain flatwood sandhills. This area in the southern part of South Carolina holds one of the highest frog diversities in the United States, which is significant. It has other important species such as spotted turtles, pine snakes, eastern diamondbacks, pine wood snakes, bird voice tree frogs, tiger salamanders, and several others. Again, as I said, a really great diversity of different species. And again, I'd like to point out that this little tract here, the only kind of gopher tortoise spot in the state, which is there solely because of expert opinion that never would have been picked up from models. So if you have any questions on those specific areas, we can take those at the end. But I kind of wanted to just give you that quick run through a state and to show you some of how wide a variety of habitats and species conservation that these PARCas can provide. So obviously the state of conservation right now is that the landscape is constantly changing in really big ways, and so we felt it was really important to identify and kind of try to plan for threats to some of these PARCas. So thanks to some really great funding from the South Atlantic LCC, we were able to kind of look at some of the vulnerability of these PARCas. And we did this by looking at a similar method to Magnus et al. From 2011. And what Magnus et al. Did was classified vulnerability into 3 categories: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And that combines with sensitivity and adaptive capacity combined to represent resilience. And so for exposure, we looked at 3 main habitat type, or 3 main threat categories that we'll go into, and those include habitat change, climate change, and sea level rise. And adaptive capacity, again, we looked at, we kind of took out from the Magnus study that they included sensitivity, which is the presence of rare or threatened species, and we kind of took that out of our analysis because the PARCA selection process purposefully is biased towards rare or threatened species, so we thought that that could really skew some of these results, so we focused mostly on ability of species to shift their ranges. So this is what that looks like across the South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative here, the range of that. The first threat of temperature or climate change. Again, this is was a fairly complex model and process, but to sum it up in pretty basic terms, we used the rate of annual change from 1950 to 2006 to look at which of these regions were most threatened by climate change. And this makes the assumption that climate change is going to continue in the same trend. So you can take that for what it is, but this has been shown to be pretty consistent in a increasingly common way to model species response to climate change. And so you can see that there's a huge variation here in threat levels to different parkas based on climate change. And so again, this is something that as we're creating conservation plans and future efforts to deal with climate change, it's important to be able to look at these different priority amphibian and reptile conservation areas and be able to identify climate change threats. The second category of threat we looked at was land cover or land use change. And again, a huge variation in threats from land cover. You can see that not as high along the waterways, but some areas are extremely threatened by land cover change. And of course, another threat with climate change here is that we identified with sea level change. We used the SLAM models for this. And you can see that the good news is that not all coastal parkas are highly endangered from sea level change, but that certainly a good majority are threatened by sea level change, especially the further north in the South Atlantic LCC that you go, and this area that's really threatened really represents a extremely important sea turtle nesting habitat, and so this is something we really need to consider with habitat management for these parkas. So in summary, we can see that Atlantic coastal areas have the highest risk of sea level changes, and a little further inland have a high risk from development, and in fact also have some of the highest risk from temperature changes, and so those are important to be kind of considered when we're trying to manage these parkas or to prioritize them in terms of habitat acquisition or habitat management. We can see that the Piedmont is really most threatened by development and land loss, which is historically the same threat that's really threatened a lot of the Piedmont populations. And the Gulf Coastal Plain area has a fairly low vulnerability. And in fact, if we go back here, some of these populations up here, or parkas up here, also not only have a fairly low vulnerability, but also have a high capacity for resilience. So that's kind of the good news in this. The bad news is that a lot of these parkas in general have a fairly low capacity for resilience. As we know from a number of different studies and scenarios, amphibians and reptiles typically don't disperse as well as other groups. So the chance for them to be able to move away from climate change and habitat loss is much greater, or much less than other taxa groups. All right, so do we have any questions on that?
Yes, there have been several questions, and just going back to the acronym that we asked about earlier, somebody did say that they thought maybe it was standard deviation of group mean and standard deviation of class mean, but I put JJ's email address into the chat box, so if anybody does have further questions about that, or JJ, I'm not sure if you know if that sounds correct off the top of your head, but okay. So
Yeah,
I did put JJ's email into the chat box, so if there are other questions. So some of the questions that came up after that, and you kind of touched on this one, and I think you've already answered it, but just in case, will the parkas be integrated with landscape conservation collaborative efforts such as the South Atlantic LCC?
Again, we're hoping so. The South Atlantic LCC funded a lot of this work, and so we're hoping that LCCs across the country will kind of take up this charge because it's a great kind of planning conservation tool. And again, hopefully within the next year, park itself and hopefully regional park and hopefully all of you will take this up as part of your kind of conservation mission. Okay,
and the next question was, when do you anticipate finishing parkas for the remaining southeastern states? And also kind of a related question, will Tennessee and Mississippi be included in those as well?
Sure. So because PARC and SEPARC are at least largely volunteer efforts, these are efforts that need to be kind of championed by local organizations and groups. So hopefully somebody within SEPARC can take up these remaining states. We'd love to see that get done. Of course, funding is always an issue, although it doesn't take a huge amount of funding to get this work done, but there does have to be some. So hopefully within the next year, the rest of the southeastern states will be completed, and other regions are moving forward as well. Okay.
The next question was, as a land trust, how do we find out if a tract we are considering is within a PARCA?
That's a great question. Very soon, these PARCAs that we've already identified will be posted onto at least the SEPARC website, and hopefully the PARC website as well. And we hope to also, when we post that information, provide spatial data, so both Google Earth and ArcGIS files.
Okay.
Until then, you can email myself or somebody else associated with SEPARC.
Okay, great. The next question is, does the model weigh proximity to existing protected areas as a higher priority? Does the model that you're using, I think this was in reference to the maps, does the model weigh proximity to existing protected areas as a higher priority?
It does not, except for in the case that calculation does go into the vulnerability assessment, but it doesn't have any weight in terms of identifying, in terms of the PARCA metric of identifying PARCAs. And there's a number of reasons that we did that, which again is something you could email me about. But inevitably, a lot of that kind of thinking does get integrated into the selection process by the team of local experts who actually select the parkas.
Okay. And then somebody was wondering if you could talk about the costs a little bit. They don't say exactly, so Jan, if you could elaborate on that a little bit. In the meantime, while we're waiting for her, somebody else had mentioned on some of the maps if there's a capability for you to actually point at the areas that you're talking about. So you do have that capability if there's any more slides coming up that have the map if you're talking about a specific area. Yeah,
no, sorry, I thought I had
it wasn't
that clicked.
showing up for some reason, so that might be.
There, how about that? There.
No.
Can you see the arrow now?
Okay, so Jan's question was, how much did it cost? How much funding was provided for the work? Yes, we can see an arrow now.
Okay, good. Sure. So it really is going to depend on. I guess the question is, well, how much did it cost? We had in the range of around $100,000 of funding, and a lot of that funding cost goes towards the vulnerability modeling in matrices and some of the initial modeling. I think in general, going forward, selecting these parkas, we could actually select a lot of them for a lower price. However, there's a great value to kind of looking at the vulnerability across that, and that takes people's time and in several cases postdocs and things like that.
Okay, great. Well, that's all of the questions that we have for now.
Okay. Great. So just to talk about kind of some of the future of parkas and what they can be used for. Again, this is kind of going over some of the goals we had, but putting them actually into conservation. So, we kind of see these parkas going towards applied conservation in three main areas of public awareness, land protection and management, and species conservation. And we'll talk about these individually. So, of course, public awareness is hugely important in conservation today, and we're hoping to kind of bank on this and bank on a lot of the kind of recent trends and advances of citizen science and smartphone apps and those types of things. But from a real basic level, land managers can promote areas as parkas, which helps raise profiles to visitors and hopefully gets the general public to care more about parkas and herps in general. We can also obviously help use parkas for land protection. The kind of real obvious things is that parkas identify specific areas for acquisition, and this could be any type of acquisition, whether it's straight up habitat purchasing or conservation easements, or especially land management. We think they can be used to provide leverage to encourage funding and future programs of easements and habitat conservation plans, etc. We hope that they can help prioritize and relieve pressure on vulnerable parkas, things such as corridor mapping, etc. And of course, as I've said a couple times here, a lot of these parkas, if you noticed, are already on publicly owned land, and so we're hoping that identification of those areas as parkas and for private landowners can help really encourage herp-friendly management plans and restoration and private involvement such as an RCS, etc. And of course, on the single species level, because we choose parkas a lot of times based on a few rare taxa or a few rare and imperiled and important taxa, this gives us a way to prioritize monitoring of sites, different areas and different sites. Long term, we can think about whether PARCA designations help maintain rare species or help populations grow. And of course, it also provides a potential for reintroduction sites. For example, the indigo reintroduction program that has recently been undertaken in the Conecuh National Forest, which is also a Alabama parka. So we're hoping that that could be something that becomes more and more. And I just kind of wanted to lastly point out that parkas are a really dynamic process. They're intended to be responsive to changing conservation trends and changing landscape. So, none of these southeastern parka states that we've completed so far are the parkas are set in stone. We can always add new parkas. We can always adjust existing boundaries. But really, this is where the entire conservation community comes into play in terms of using parkas as a tool, and in terms of constantly thinking of them and how they can be improved. So we're hoping that a lot of you all get involved in PARC and parkas and can see this process forward. And just in general, coming soon, as I mentioned, we have the Southeastern PARCA publication for the states we've done, and the Northeast is also working on a PARCA process, and they should be out fairly soon as well. So with that, I'd like to thank the following people and organizations, especially all of you and all of the people who participated in the state meetings. We had over 100 participants in those state meetings, total across all states, and so it's a really great turnout for these, for an important conservation effort. And of course, South Atlantic LCC, which provided funding for a lot of this work, and all of the following people. And with that, I'll thank all these organizations, and thank you all again for coming to this and participating and asking questions. And if we have any final questions, I can take those.
Thanks. And for everybody who did come in late, again, my name is Jennifer Evans. I'm with Extension Forestry at North Carolina State University, and we had presenting today Dr. J.J. Apodaca. And we do have just a few more questions, and I know we're running really short on time here, but I think it's going to be important. Somebody who's asking, are the points of contact available for each state in the Southeast region? Are there points of contact that are available for each state?
In terms of the parkas, I think if you contact your regional park, Southeast Park in this case, we can point you in the right direction.
Okay, great. And just as a reminder, JJ's email is posted into the chat box also. And then you had mentioned that there's an upcoming publication, but are there any existing publications, including journal articles, that describe your work? There's nothing published yet. However, it's close. Okay. Hopefully, the major publication that folks can go back and reference is the PARCA document that's available on parkplace.org. Okay, great. Well, that was all of the questions that we had, and we are out of time right now. So I just wanted to thank you, JJ, for your presentation. And if anybody does have any further questions, you can either email us at separc.org or email JJ directly. And I just wanted to say that I just published a link that you can either click on, or in just a second, if everybody stays on, we ask that we have a post-webinar survey that we'd like everybody to fill out, whether or not you're going to be getting CFEs or continuing education credits. If you wouldn't mind filling out the survey, we'd really appreciate it. And then if you are planning to get continuing education credits, go ahead and fill out the survey, and then there's also going to be a short quiz and then a request form. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and I'm going to push out the link. You can either click on the link I just put in the chat box, or I'm going to go ahead and push out the link to everybody right now. So thank you, everybody, again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.